The ship touched down at the Vethrani Compact's primary station at 0347 standard hours, and Mara Voss was awake for all of it. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She'd spent the transit reviewing the briefing packets, cross-referencing the cultural dossiers, memorizing the names and titles and preferred honorifics of every ranking member of the Vethrani Diplomatic Council. The ship's attendant, a young man from Helsinki who'd been doing compact transfers for 4 years and had the quiet, careful eyes of someone who'd learned to stop asking questions, had brought her coffee 3 times without being asked and never once mentioned that. She'd barely moved from her chair. She appreciated him for that. She appreciated anyone who understood when to leave things alone. The station was called the Veythru Seat, which translated loosely to something like the place of correct order. In the Compact's cosmology, order wasn't just a preference. It was a theological position. The universe had a shape, and everything in it had a designated role within that shape, and deviation from that role was not merely disobedience, but a kind of ontological wrongness. They'd explained this in the briefing, phrased diplomatically, stripped of the implications. Mara had read between those lines without difficulty. She was 31 years old. She'd grown up in Dusseldorf, done her political science degree at Humboldt, followed it with 2 years of xenolinguistics at the Institute, then 4 years working accord compliance in the outer settlements. She spoke 3 human languages, and enough Vethrani to follow a complex conversation, though her accent was apparently terrible. A senior instructor at the Institute had once described her Vethrani as sounding like someone chewing gravel while attempting to recite poetry. She'd taken it as a compliment. Mara had a talent for turning assessments of her inadequacy into small, private victories. The assignment was simple on paper. The Vethrani Compact and the Terrestrial Accord had been in a state of provisional cooperation for 6 years, which was the diplomatic phrasing for, "We are not technically at war, but neither of us is certain this will last, and we have agreed to exchange liaison officers as a gesture of mutual good faith," which is itself another diplomatic phrasing for, "We are holding each other's people as a form of very polite insurance." Mara was the 7th human liaison to serve at the Veythru Seat. None of the previous 6 had completed their full 18-month rotation. The official record listed their departures as voluntary reassignments. The unofficial record, the one you had to be trusted by certain people to access, said something more complicated. She hadn't asked about the previous liaisons during her intake briefing. She'd noted the gap, filed it in the part of her mind labeled things to understand when I understand more, and moved on. This was how Mara operated. She gathered information. She let it settle. She waited until it arranged itself into a picture she could work with. She was patient in the way that people who grew up without much patience eventually become. Not naturally, but thoroughly. The way scar tissue is thorough. The airlock hissed open and the Vethrani air hit her first. It was warm. Not unpleasantly so. The Compact maintained their station environments at conditions appropriate for human habitation, which was itself a considered gesture, though she suspected it cost them very little and signaled more than it gave. The smell was harder to categorize. Something faintly mineral, like standing water over smooth stones, with an undertone of something biological that she couldn't name. She'd read that humans often described Vethrani environments as smelling like a forest that had never been touched by weather. She found that accurate enough to be useful. A delegation was waiting at the terminal. There were 3 of them, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested it wasn't accidental. Vethrani were bipedal, roughly humanoid in proportion, but taller by about 30 centimeters on average, with a secondary joint in the lower leg that gave their movement a slight, uncanny quality, like watching someone walk a heartbeat out of phase with what your brain expected. Their skin ranged from pale gray to deep blue-black depending on health and emotional state. Their eyes were large, pupil-filling amber gold, and they didn't blink the way humans did. They blinked in long, slow cycles that could last 30 seconds at a time. Mara had learned not to read meaning into this. It wasn't inattention. It wasn't aggression. It was simply how they worked. The one at the center stepped forward. He was, by every measure in the briefing, striking, tall even by Vethrani standards, with the pale silver-gray coloring that indicated high accord rank, moving with the kind of unhurried fluency that spoke of someone who had never once doubted whether a room belonged to him. "Lesen Voss," he said. His standard was precise, lightly accented, and delivered with the cadence of someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than from human contact. "I am André Voss of the 3rd Compact Circle. "We have been anticipating your arrival." She shook his hand, a gesture he performed with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times and found it pleasantly quaint. His hand was cool, with the slightly different pressure distribution of Vethrani anatomy, but he held the shake an appropriate length. He'd been brief, too. "Thank you for meeting me personally," Mara said. Her Vethrani phrasing for gratitude was grammatically correct. She watched his face do the thing Vethrani faces did when they registered approval. A very slight deepening of the amber in the iris. Barely perceptible if you didn't know to look. She knew to look. "The third circle maintains personal oversight of all Accord liaisons," he said, moving to guide her through the terminal. "You will be housed within our compound. The arrangement has proven most productive." The word he used in his standard was productive, but the Vethrani undertone, the soft consonant shift that modified standard words with compact, meaning placed it closer to satisfying, she filed that too. The compound was extraordinary. That was the honest word for it. The Vethrani had a gift for architecture that balanced function and beauty in ways that human design rarely achieved, and the third circle's residential wing was a masterwork. High ceilings with bioluminescent paneling that shifted color with the station's time cycle, corridors of polished composite that looked like stone and walked like it, rooms that were large enough to feel open without being large enough to feel empty. It was the kind of beauty that asked you to feel grateful for being inside it. Mara had grown up poor enough to know exactly what that kind of beauty was designed to do. Andre Voss showed her the quarters himself. A suite of 3 rooms, human-proportioned, human temperature, with a small library of physical texts in both standard and Vethrani, a workspace interface calibrated for human hands, and a window that looked out over the station's central atrium. It was more comfortable than any posting she'd ever held. More comfortable, frankly, than her apartment in Berlin. "This is generous," she said. "The compact provides," he said, simply. There was a woman in the doorway of the connecting room. Mara saw her for only a moment before the door closed again, a figure Vethrani tall, with skin at the deep blue end of the spectrum, eyes that caught the bioluminescent light and held it. She was there, and then she wasn't, the door easing shut with the soft precision of Vethrani engineering. "My bonded," Andre Voss said, without turning. His tone was even, informative. "Nina Ra. She suffers from periods of difficulty." Mara looked at the closed door. "I'm sorry to hear that. It is a medical concern," he said. "You will not need to concern yourself with it. The compound staff are well trained. She is well cared for." She nodded. She noted the passive construction. Well cared for, staff managed, not her concern, and filed it with everything else. That night she sat at her workspace interface and wrote her first dispatch. It was a standard arrival report, calibrated for her supervisor back at Accord headquarters in Geneva, appropriately bland and measured. She noted the compound's layout, the key personnel, the diplomatic calendar she'd been provided. She mentioned Andre Voss's evident authority within the third circle. She noted Nina Ra in one line, marked as potentially relevant to compound dynamics, no elaboration. Then she turned off the interface, got into bed in the alien dark, listened to the mineral water smell and the very faint sound of the station cycling through systems she couldn't name, and lay there thinking about the 6 liaisons who'd come before her and the phrase voluntary reassignment, and eventually fell asleep. The first week was calibration. She learned the rhythms of the compound. The staff, 4 Vethrani and 2 humans on secondment from the settlement populations, moved through their routines with the particular quietness of people who had learned what it cost to be heard at the wrong moment. She watched them, and they watched her in return. The senior Vethrani aide, a sharp-faced woman called Avith Sue, showed Mara the compound with the polished efficiency of someone who has given a tour many times and expects nothing specific from the person receiving it. Andre Voss was absent much of the time. Third circle duties, meetings, the complex machinery of compact governance. He returned in the evenings with the composed ease of someone who is exactly as tired as they choose to appear, and they would share the evening meal together, he and Mara, and occasionally Nina Ra when her condition permitted. This was how Andre Voss phrased it, when her condition permits, as though Nina Ra herself had no opinion on the matter. Nina Ra was there at the 4th dinner. Mara had almost not noticed her coming in. She moved very quietly, with the careful precision of someone who has learned to occupy space gently, to not disturb the air more than necessary. She sat at the far end of the table, outside the primary conversation circle, and applied herself to her meal with a focused intensity that might have read as rudeness in another context, but here read as something else. Something Mara recognized, the practice of keeping your head down until you have a clearer map. Their eyes met once during the meal, just once. Nina Ra looked away first, but in the half-second before she did, Mara clocked something. Not fear exactly. Something more structured than fear. Something that had been fear long enough to become strategy. After the meal, as the staff cleared the table, Andre Voss touched Nina Ra's shoulder in a way that was visible. A proprietary hand on the back of her neck, brief, calibrated. Nina Ra didn't react visibly. She'd been not reacting for a long time. Mara said goodnight to both of them and went to her rooms and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she'd seen. The next morning, a gift appeared on her workspace. A small communications device, elegant, Vethrani crafted, calibrated for her human hand. A note from Andre Voss. For your convenience within the compound, this will allow you to contact any resident or staff member directly. A gesture of welcome. She turned it over in her hands. Vethrani comms devices had standard tracking protocols built into them. She'd learned this in the briefing, noted matter-of-factly, presented as a security feature. Naturally, the compact would want to ensure the safety of their liaison. Naturally, she set it on the workspace and used her own Accord-issued unit for all personal communications. She carried the Vethrani device with her everywhere. 3 weeks in, Nina Ra spoke to her alone for the first time. Mara was in the compound's secondary library, a smaller room than the main one, used less frequently, with physical texts and a window that faced the station's outer hull rather than the atrium. She was working through a Vethrani legal compendium, not because she expected to need it, but because she liked to understand the rules of the room she was sitting in, and the compact's legal architecture was the most explicit documentation of how they thought. The door opened. Nina Ra stopped in the doorway when she saw Mara, and for a moment both of them assessed the situation. I didn't know anyone was in here, Nina Ra said, in Vethrani. Her voice was lower than expected, and her Vethrani had the particular precision of someone who speaks their own language with great care, as though every word has a weight they have learned to respect. I can leave if you need the room, Mara said, in her reportedly gravel-chewing Vethrani. Something moved through Nina Ra's expression, something that might, in different circumstances, have been amusement. No, please stay. She came in, selected a text from the shelves. She clearly knew exactly where it was, didn't scan, went straight to it, and settled into the chair across from Mara. She opened the text and began reading. They sat in silence for a while. The station cycled through its quiet systems. The light shifted toward afternoon. You're reading the Accord Binding Acts, Nina Ra said eventually, without looking up from her own text. Yes. Why? Because I like to understand what I've agreed to. A pause. Most of your predecessors didn't bother. Mara watched her. You remember them? All 6. She turned a page. The gesture was exact. They were each assigned here for varying lengths of time. They each found the compound comfortable. They each left before their rotation completed. The record says voluntary reassignment. Nina Ra looked up. Her amber eyes, not the warm amber of Andre Voss's, but something darker, more bronze, the color of old metal, held Mara's gaze with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of someone who was fine, but of someone who was practiced, being steady until it became structural. Yes, she said, that is what the record says. She looked back at her text. Mara watched her for another moment. Are you allowed to read in here? Alone? The question was direct and maybe rude, and she said it anyway. Nina Ra's hand paused over the page, just briefly. Then, the compound has no rule against it. She meant there is no rule that forbids it, which is not the same as saying I do it freely, and she knew that Mara would understand the distinction, and she had chosen to say it anyway, which told Mara something about Nina Ra's judgment. Good, Mara said, and went back to her compendium. They read together for another hour without speaking. When Nina Ra left, she nodded once at the door. Mara nodded back. It was not nothing. The social calendar of the Third Circle was, like most diplomatic social calendars, a form of organized performance. Mara attended events with Andre Voss, represented the Accord with the appropriate combination of courtesy and quiet competence, and learned the faces and styles and allegiances of the people she was surrounded by. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Andre Voss was an excellent host. She could not fault him on that. He was attentive, thoughtful, generous with introductions, adept at smoothing the small conversational frictions that arose at the intersection of two cultures. He spoke of humans with a kind of considered affection, the way one might speak of a clever pet that had learned an impressive number of tricks. He never said anything overtly diminishing. He never needed to. The entire frame of reference accomplished that effortlessly. At these events, Nina Ra was sometimes present and sometimes not. When she was present, she maintained the particular composure of someone performing composure. When she wasn't present, Andre Voss would note her absence briefly. She is resting. Or the compound physician recommended quiet this evening, and then move on. The compound physician. Mara had met him twice. A Vethrani man named Torel. Careful and thorough in the way of someone who has calibrated his thoroughness to avoid finding certain things. She logged that too. 5 weeks in, she found Nina Ra in the secondary library, again, and the week after that, and the week after that. These were not arranged meetings. She would simply be there already, or arrive while Mara was there, and they would read, sometimes in silence, sometimes with fragments of conversation that began formally and gradually became less so. She learned. Nina Ra had been bonded to Andre Voss for 11 years. She had been trained as a cultural historian, specializing in compact records from before the current political era. She was, by every indication, extremely intelligent in a way she had learned not to display. She had a daughter, a young girl named Seth, who lived in the educational residences within the station and visited on designated days, and whose visits Nina Ra spoke of with a warmth that was different in kind from every other emotion Mara had observed in her. Unperformed, uncalibrated, simply and entirely real. She learned Nina Ra had been treated by compact physicians 3 times for what was recorded as episodes of psychological instability, once following a period of extended isolation in the compound's upper residential wing, twice following what was recorded as self-harm, though the injuries, in the medical record she was not supposed to have accessed and did, were not consistent with the standard patterns. She learned the previous human liaison, a man named Prakash, from the settlement populations of what had been India, had been close to Nina Ra, close enough that his departure had been registered in the medical records as a precipitating factor in an episode of destabilization. She sat with all of this for a long time. 6 weeks in, she was preparing for a day visit to an adjacent station with Andre Voss, a formal inspection of the compact's agricultural sector, which had the kind of low-grade importance that kept diplomatic calendars filled without producing anything of note, when she found Nina Ra in the atrium, standing at the railing that overlooked the lower levels, looking down with an expression of remote, studied blankness. Mara stopped beside her. "You're not coming today?" "I have a medical appointment." With Torel, a fractional hesitation. "Yes." Mara looked at the atrium below. "How is Seth?" Something in Nina Ra's face softened, just slightly, like a door that has been held shut for a long time giving a fraction. "She is well. She has been studying the early compact chronicles. She is interested in how things used to be. Smart girl, yes." Mara watched her for a moment. "Nina Ra, what was the previous liaison like?" A longer pause this time. Nina Ra's hands on the railing were still. "He was kind," she said, finally. "He did not understand the compound quickly enough. He trusted what was offered to him." "Did he have a Vethrani communications device?" She looked at Mara. Her bronze eyes were very calm. "They all did," she said. "Every one of them." They stood there for a moment longer. Below in the atrium, compound staff moved through their routines. "I've been using my Accord unit," Mara said. Something shifted in Nina Ra's expression. Not quite relief, but adjacent to it. Something careful and long compressed beginning, just fractionally, to release. "That would be wise," she said. Mara nodded and went to meet Andre Voss. The shift happened around week 9. Though Mara understood later that nothing had actually shifted, she had simply begun to see more clearly what had always been there. Andre Voss had been, throughout, attentive and generous. He showed her aspects of compact culture with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. He facilitated introductions to significant figures. He was a good conversationalist, a thoughtful interpreter of compact law and tradition, a patient explicator of the theological underpinnings of Vethrani political philosophy. When she made errors, misreadings of protocol, grammatical stumbles in her Vethrani, moments of cultural miscalibration, he corrected them graciously and without condescension. He also began, gradually, to suggest things, not commands, not requests even, suggestions, framed so naturally within the flow of conversation that it took Mara 2 weeks of accumulated instances before she began to log them. He would mention, in passing, that the secondary library was perhaps not the most comfortable reading environment for someone of Mara's status. There was a much nicer reading room in the main residential wing. He would note, while reviewing her week's schedule, that certain event appearances might be considered optional for a liaison of her current standing. He would observe that the compound's kitchen staff were skilled at human cuisine, and that Mara's practice of occasionally preparing her own meals. She'd found the kitchen at 0600 twice, making coffee in the proper way, the German way, the way her mother had made it, was perhaps unnecessary. Small things, each one reasonable. Each one with the quiet effect of reducing the places as she went, the things she did without his knowledge, the moments that were solely hers. She kept going to the kitchen at 0600. She kept meeting Nina Ra in the secondary library. She kept using her Accord communications unit. She watched Andre Voss watch her do these things, and she watched the quality of his attention change, very slowly, from warm to something that had warmth's texture but not its temperature. Week 10. She was working at her desk when she heard raised voices from the connecting room. Not her connecting room, the one on the far side of the suite, the one that led to the main residential wing. She went still and listened. It was Andre Voss's voice, speaking in rapid Vethrani, low but carrying the particular edge of someone accustomed to being heard at whatever volume they chose. She could not make out the words clearly. She heard Nina Ra's voice respond, shorter, quieter, and then Andre Voss again, and then silence. The next morning, Nina Ra did not appear at breakfast. She did not appear in the library that week. Andre Voss mentioned, with the mild informational tone of noting a weather pattern, that Nina Ra was having a difficult period and had opted for quiet. Mara ate her breakfast. She said appropriate things about the day's agenda. She did not look at the closed door of the far connecting room. She thought about a word in Vethrani that meant approximately the order of things as they are meant to be. Week 11, she found what she had not been looking for. She'd been sent to the records annex to retrieve a set of historical Accord documents, a task that would normally fall to staff, but Andre Voss had mentioned it would be appropriate for her to retrieve them personally, and she had agreed without comment. The records annex was a large, cool space in the lower residential wing, organized with the Vethrani system of categorical sequencing that made human alphabetical filing look like organized chaos. She found the Accord documents within 10 minutes. She spent another 40 minutes in the annex, reading. Not the Accord documents, other things. The compound's administrative records were housed in the same wing, which she had known. The personnel files were formatted in Vethrani categorical sequencing, which she understood. The liaison records were categorized under Accord Provisional Cooperation, Third Circle, Subfile. Assigned personages. She read 6 personnel files in 40 minutes. She read them quickly, efficiently, taking in the key information with the practiced speed of someone who has spent a career extracting signal from documents. All 6 of her predecessors had come to the compound as she had, qualified, experienced, assigned with the understanding that this was a significant post. All 6 had been provided with Vethrani communications devices within the first week. All 6 had developed close relationships with Andre Voss over the first 2 months. All 6 had been removed from the posting before month 4. The official records recorded health concerns, personal circumstances, voluntary requests. The medical addendum records, accessible at her clearance level, which she was only now realizing Andre Voss had perhaps not reviewed carefully when assigning her access, told different stories, histories of distress, destabilization. One record noted chronic disorientation as a presenting symptom. Another noted an inability to perform professional duties as a consequence of psychological distress, which had subsequently been attributed to an underlying vulnerability in the individual. The underlying vulnerability in the individual. She stood in the cold records annex for a moment, looking at that phrase. She felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something more like the feeling of a picture coming into focus that you had half suspected and fully dreaded seeing clearly. She retrieved the Accord documents she'd been sent for. She returned to the compound. She had dinner with Andre Voss. She was a perfectly adequate dinner companion and gave nothing away, which was a skill she had been developing since she was 8 years old in a too-small apartment in Dusseldorf, and had learned, through the patient instruction of difficult circumstances, that sometimes surviving meant being very good at appearing to be exactly who someone expected you to be. After dinner in her room, she sat at her workspace and ran a communications check on the Vethrani device she'd been carrying for 11 weeks. She confirmed what she'd suspected. It pinged the compound's tracking system every 4 minutes. She confirmed also that the tracking records went back 11 weeks, and that her location within the compound had been logged with perfect regularity. She set the device on the workspace. She hummed very quietly a song her mother used to sing in the mornings, old German pop, entirely inappropriate to the setting, enormously comforting. She hummed it for about 30 seconds and then stopped. She began to plan. The direct moment came because of a flower. Vethrani decorative culture included a class of objects called civilith, physical, crafted items that carried significant aesthetic and social meaning, passed through family lines, valued not as investments but as continuity. André Voss's collection of civilith was displayed throughout the compound's main residential spaces, and he had mentioned them several times in a tone that communicated exactly how he felt about them. Not possessively exactly, but with the precision of someone who wants you to understand that these objects matter, and that their condition is a reflection of the respect you have for their owner. The one in Mara's primary workspace was a small crystalline construct, not large, not flashy, the kind of thing that sat in a corner and did its work quietly by being there. She had learned around week 3 that it was 300 years old and had belonged to André Voss's grandmother's line. She had subsequently been careful around it. Week 12, she was reviewing a document that required a physical reference text she'd stacked on the workspace, and the stack shifted. The civilith hit the floor. It didn't shatter, it was more robust than it looked, being Vethrani crystalline composite, but it cracked. A single crack along the lower edge, hairline fine, visible if you knew to look. She set it back on the workspace. She looked at it. She noted the time, 14:02 hours. She did not hide it. She did not try to disguise it. She was not afraid in the way she might have been, because she had spent 12 weeks building a specific kind of not afraid that was constructed out of information rather than ignorance. She knew more about this compound and what it had cost people than André Voss was aware of, and that knowledge was, if not a shield, then at least a map. André Voss returned at 1800. He came to the workspace to discuss the next week's agenda, as he usually did. He saw the cracked civilith. His face did something that Mara watched carefully. The warmth that had been thinning for weeks did not disappear. It shifted into something that had warmth's surface and nothing underneath it. He picked up the object. He examined the crack. He set it back down with a deliberateness that was communicating something. "This is a significant loss," he said in standard, which he used when he wanted precision over nuance. "I'm sorry," she said. "It fell. Things that are handled properly do not fall." She met his eyes. "I understand." He looked at her for a moment. The amber gold of his irises was at the pale end of the spectrum, which the briefing dossier noted as indicating controlled displeasure. He looked at her the way someone looks when they are deciding whether what they are seeing is going to require adjustment. "I would like you to join me in the upper residential wing this evening," he said. "There is a matter I wish to discuss regarding your continued placement here." "Of course," she said. She went. The upper residential wing was the wing she had heard raised voices from. It occupied the 3rd level of the compound's primary structure, and its rooms were larger than those of the main wing, the walls higher, the proportions subtly different. The corridor leading to the rooms at the end was paneled in a darker composite, the light from the bioluminescent strips cooler, the whole space carrying the feeling of something that was sealed off from the rest of the compound, not by any physical barrier, but by the particular quality of its silence. The room at the end of the corridor was a study. It had a desk, a seating arrangement, shelves of texts. It also had, in the far wall, a door. It was a door she hadn't seen floor plans for, which she had noticed when she reviewed the compound schematics that Edith Sue had shown her in week 1. André Voss sat behind the desk. She sat across from him. He spoke for a while about the expectations of the Accord Liaison program, about the standards of conduct required at the 3rd circle level, about the importance of care and attention to the shared spaces and objects of the compound. He spoke the way a person speaks when the content of what they are saying is not the point. When the point is the speaking itself, the establishment of a frame within which the listener is a subject rather than an interlocutor. She listened. "I think," she said, when he reached a natural pause, "that you should tell me what you actually want to say." The room was very quiet. Something moved across André Voss's face. It was, she thought, something close to genuine surprise. The surprise of someone who has been doing a thing for a long time and is accustomed to a particular kind of response and is encountering a different one. "I beg your pardon?" I've been watching this compound for 12 weeks, she said. Her voice was even. I know what happened to the 6 people who came before me. I know what the tracking device you gave me has been recording. I know what the medical records in the annex say, and I know that you don't know I can read Vethrani categorical filing, 'cause you didn't check that in my competency file before assigning me annex access. She let that settle. I think you should tell me what you actually want to say. Andre Voss was still. He was still in the way that large, confident things go still when they are genuinely recalculating. She watched him process what she'd said, and she watched the recalibration happen, and she watched the thing that came next. Not the warmth, not the coolness, but something else. The thing underneath both. You have been busy, he said. That's my job. He leaned back. He looked at her with what appeared to be something adjacent to consideration. A new register, she thought, one he did not often need. 6 of your predecessors were assigned to this compound. 6 proved unsuitable for the demands of the position. Unsuitable, she said. That's one word for it. The Vethrani Compact has always had very specific standards for those who serve within the Circle's immediate household. Standards that require a particular kind of compliance, she said. The word landed clearly. He looked at her. The Accord Binding Acts, she said. Section 14, subsection 7, clause 3, established under the Provisional Cooperation Framework. Liaisons cannot be subjected to psychological conditioning, behavioral modification, or any action that impairs their professional function or personal autonomy without formal consent and Accord oversight. The treaty you signed, the one your administration ratified. She watched him. I've been reading them for 12 weeks. Another silence. Longer this time. You are quite different from your predecessors, he said. I know. She stood up. I'm going to go back to my rooms now. Tomorrow I'm going to send a full dispatch to Accord headquarters outlining the compound's liaison management history. I'm going to do this using my own communications unit, which has never logged to your tracking system. And then I'm going to continue doing my job, which is liaison work, which I'm good at. She walked to the door. Lays and Voss. She turned. His face had shifted again, not to warmth, not to coldness. Something flatter. Something evaluating. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who is encountering a variable they had not included in their model. You are not afraid, he said. I am, she said. But I'm also a person who knows what's in the room I'm standing in. Those two things can both be true. She walked out of the study and down the corridor and back to her rooms, and she did not look at the door in the far wall of the study, though she had noted it and would not forget it. The night was the longest of the 12 weeks. She did not sleep immediately. She sat at her workspace and wrote out everything she knew, in a document encrypted on her Accord unit, in a format she could use if she needed to. She wrote it methodically, starting from the arrival and working forward, including every observed detail, every deduction, every question she hadn't yet answered. It took 2 hours. When she was done, she read it back and found it useful and correct and heavier than she'd expected it to feel. At 0200, she went to the kitchen and made coffee the right way. There was no one else there. The kitchen was still and dark except for the low auxiliary light and the Vethrani hum of the ventilation system. She stood at the counter with her coffee and listened to the station breathe around her and thought about Nina Ra. She had been not thinking about Nina Ra carefully and deliberately for 2 weeks, since she'd reviewed the medical records and understood what she was looking at. She had done this because she needed to understand the compound before she could understand what to do with that understanding, and thinking too hard about Nina Ra before she had her footing would have produced something emotional rather than useful. She had her footing now. She thought about Nina Ra, who had been bonded to Andre Voss for 11 years, who had been hospitalized 3 times for events that the records attributed to her instability, who had been present for all 6 previous liaisons and had watched them arrive and had watched them leave, who had sat across from Mara in the secondary library and said, with the precision of a person measuring every word, they each found the compound comfortable. They each trusted what was offered to them, who had not said, I did not, who had not needed to. She thought about the door in the study's far wall that she had noted and not asked about. She thought about the word civilith and how the crack in the crystalline object had not been an accident. She set down her coffee and walked quietly through the compound's secondary corridor, not the main route, the service route, to the lower residential wing, the library. She sat in the dark for a moment and then turned on the low reading light. She had left a text on the table the last time she'd been here. She opened it to where she'd last stopped. She read for a while, not really reading, waiting. At 024, the door opened. Nina Ra was wrapped in the Vethrani equivalent of a dressing robe, her hair loose, her coloring at the deep blue that Mara had learned meant either distress or exhaustion or both. She stopped when she saw Mara. Then she came in. She sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. "He spoke to you tonight," Nina Ra said. "Yes. And I told him what I know." A long pause. Nina Ra's hands were folded in her lap, still, the way hands get when they've practiced being still. That was dangerous. Maybe. Mara looked at her. "What's behind the door in the study?" The pause was shorter than she expected. Nina Ra had been ready for this question. Mara understood, had been waiting to be asked it. "A room," she said. "In the compact there is a practice old, technically prohibited under current law. But the prohibition is rarely enforced in matters of household discipline. A bonded partner who behaves in a way that violates accord, the compact's own accord, not yours, can be placed in what is called a learning space. A room designed to be uncomfortable, to be instructive, to teach the body and the mind the cost of deviation." Mara did not say anything. "The records say I was hospitalized," Nina Ra continued. Her voice was flat and factual in the way that people sometimes speak about things that are too large to be spoken about emotionally. 3 times. What the records do not say is that I was hospitalized after extended periods in the learning space. Weeks, twice. Weeks in a room with insufficient light and no company and controlled nutrition and no access to Seth. Her hands shifted in her lap. The hospitalizations were Andre Voss's way of managing the results. Torel is thorough in the right directions. Mara thought of the phrase underlying vulnerability in the individual and felt something cold and clear and absolutely furious that she kept out of, her voice with the precision of 12 weeks of practice. "The previous liaisons," she said, "did they know?" Some of them came close to knowing. Prakash, the last one, knew enough to be concerned. Andre Voss manages these things carefully. He gives the liaison a device that tells him what they know and when they know it. He gives them comfort and attention. He creates, very gradually, a situation in which the liaison is isolated enough and destabilized enough that when the reassignment occurs, when he reports to accord oversight, that the liaison has proved unsuitable. They are not themselves in a position to contradict the assessment with much authority. The bioluminescent light shifted on its slow cycle. The library was very quiet. "He did it to them," Mara said, "and it worked." "Yes. Why didn't you tell any of them directly?" Nina Ra looked at her steadily. "Because I did not know, with any of them, whether telling them would help me or destroy the only safety I had managed to establish. He monitors communications. He monitors movement. He is very good at making the people around him feel that their understanding of the situation is adequate, and therefore that no further investigation is needed." A pause. "You were different. I knew from the second week. What gave me away?" Something crossed Nina Ra's face. It might have been the first genuine smile Mara had seen from her. Small, brief, very tired. "You used the service corridor." Mara thought about that. He doesn't expect people to use the service routes. No. He expects comfort to make people use the main routes, the easy ones. She looked at her folded hands. "I have been using the service routes for 11 years. They sat in the blue-shifted library light." Mara thought about what she was hearing and about what it meant and about the difference between the 2 kinds of survival. The kind that gets you through the day and the kind that gets you out. "Seth," she said, "she is in the educational residences. If I leave without proper grounds, he will challenge the custody arrangement under compact law. I lose." Her voice was very even. "If he is formally found to have violated the Accord Provisional Cooperation Treaty, if there is documentation, submitted through official channels, from a liaison of Accord standing, the enforcement protocols give me grounds. Third circle violations trigger an automatic review of associated compact household arrangements." Mara stared at her. "You've been waiting for someone with standing," she said. "Not accusation, something else." "I have been waiting," Nina Ra said quietly, "for someone who came in through the service corridor." The thing that had been building in Mara's chest for 12 weeks, the careful, maintained, constructed clarity, shifted. Not collapsed, not broke, shifted. Made room for something that was not purely professional, a recognition, one woman to another, of the difference between plans that protect you and plans that only protect what little you have left. She looked at Nina Ra. "Tell me what you need from me." The dispatch to Geneva took her 4 hours to compile. She was thorough because she needed to be thorough. Half measures would produce half results. and half results would leave Nina Ra where she was and leave Andre Voss with sufficient deniability and leave the learning space in the study ready for the next person who wandered into it. She used the full scope of what she documented. The tracking device, the 6 previous liaisons, the medical records, the administrative files, the Accord Binding Act's violations. She sent it in 3 separate encrypted packages to 3 separate Accord addresses, which was a redundancy she had set up in week 7 because she liked redundancies. She sent the dispatch at 0515. She then made more coffee and thought carefully about the next 12 hours. At 0600, she was in the kitchen, visibly, when Andre Voss appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, or rather, could read only partially, because the part she could read was the part that had decided something, and she did not yet know what. "You sent a dispatch last night," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I send dispatches regularly. Not at this hour, not in this format. How would you know the format if you haven't intercepted it?" A pause. "I have resources." "So do I," she said. "I have 3 copies of that dispatch in 3 independent Accord archives, and I have a direct communication going out in 45 minutes to the Accord's 3rd Circle liaison coordinator confirming the same information with a live voice call, encrypted through my Accord unit, which has, as I mentioned, never logged to your tracking system." She set down her coffee. "I have the Accord Binding Acts, Section 14, Subsection 7, and I have 11 years of your household records." She watched him. He was still. The calculated, assessing stillness of someone restructuring a model. "What do you want, Liaison Voss?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it for 12 weeks, without knowing exactly what the moment would look like, and now that it was here, she found it was simpler than she'd anticipated. Not simple in an uncomplicated way, simple in the way that things become simple after a long period of complexity, when the complexity has done its work and what's left is just the truth. "I want your formal acknowledgement of the Accord violations," she said. "I want that submitted to the 3rd Circle Oversight Council and to Accord headquarters. I want Nina Ra's custody arrangements transferred under emergency humanitarian review. There's a provision in the Accord Provisional Cooperation framework that covers this, Section 22, and I've been reading it carefully for the last 6 weeks. I want access to the room behind the door in your study, and I want compact oversight to document its contents. And I want the previous 6 liaison records corrected." She met his eyes. "Those are specific humans who were made to look inadequate in an official record. That matters." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't categorize. It wasn't any of the registers she'd seen from him before. Not warmth, not coldness, not calculation. Something that might, in another person, have been a form of reckoning. "If I refuse," he said, "then I proceed with the Accord enforcement request I've already initiated, which will trigger a 3rd Circle review, which will surface the same information through official channels, which will take 4 months instead of 48 hours, and will be considerably less conducive to your continued standing within the circle." She kept her voice level, not gloating, not hard, just accurate. "This is better for you. I know that's not the point, but it's also true." The kitchen was very quiet. The ventilation system hummed its alien hum. She could smell the mineral water smell of the station and her coffee, and the specific, indefinable smell of a conversation arriving at its outcome. Andre Voss looked at her for a long time. She looked back. "How," he said finally, and the word carried something. Not quite respect. Not quite its opposite. Something more like the adjustment of a worldview that has encountered new data. "How did you know they would not prepare you to find all of this?" "Because the system was working," she said. 6 for 6. Why would you change a system that was working? He nodded, slowly. It was not agreement, it was acknowledgement. He left the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, listening to the ventilation hum, then finished her coffee. The next 4 days were a sequence of carefully managed processes. She dealt with the Accord enforcement procedures with the focused precision of someone who has spent 10 years learning how bureaucratic systems work and how to move through them efficiently. She coordinated with Geneva and with the 3rd Circle Oversight Council, which was initially resistant and then less so as the documentation she provided accumulated weight. She sat across from Andre Voss twice more in formal proceedings, and both times she said exactly what she needed to say and nothing more, and both times the careful, constructed warmth he'd maintained for 12 weeks was entirely absent, replaced by something that was at least honest in its directness. She also sat in the secondary library with Nina Ra one last time, the evening of the third day. Seth was there too. Mara had not met her before. She was 8 by Vethrani reckoning, which corresponded roughly to 11 in human developmental terms. Small, with Nina Ra's bronze-amber eyes and a particular seriousness about her that seemed less childlike than earned. She had brought a book she was reading about the early compact chronicles, and she sat on the floor beside her mother's chair and read it. And occasionally she asked Nina Ra a question about a word or a concept, and Nina Ra answered her with the careful, full attention of someone who has fought very hard for the ability to sit in a room with her child and be asked questions. Mara sat across from them and read her own text and did not interrupt and was glad to be in the room. At one point, Seth looked up from her book and regarded Mara with the open, assessing directness of a child who has not yet learned to be diplomatic about curiosity. "Are you the one who is fixing things?" she asked. Mara looked at her. "Your mother was the one who had the plan," she said. "I'm the one who showed up at the right time." Seth considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "That's also important," she said. "Yes," Mara agreed. "It is." She looked at Nina Ra, who was looking at Seth with that particular warmth. Unperformed, absolute. The only thing Mara had ever seen in this compound that required no analysis to understand. Nina Ra felt Mara's gaze and looked up. She didn't say thank you. The word was too small for what was happening, and they both knew it. She just looked at Mara with those bronze-amber eyes, and in them was something that Mara thought she would carry for a long time. The specific expression of a person who has been surviving in the only ways available to them for a very long time, and is, for the first time in a very long time, beginning to understand that surviving is not the same as living, and that the difference might actually be available to her. Mara nodded once. Nina Ra nodded back. They read together until the station's light shifted toward evening. On the 6th day, Andre Voss submitted the acknowledgement through the proper third circle channels. The custody arrangement was placed under emergency humanitarian review. The door in the study was opened in the presence of compact oversight, personnel, and Mara herself, who documented its contents with the same thorough care she'd been applying to everything for 12 weeks. The dimensions of the room, the absence of natural light, the Spartan furniture, the marks on the wall that were neither decoration nor structural, the small hidden shelf containing, she found it because she looked, a knife, worn smooth, that had clearly been used to create those marks, and had been used by whoever had been in this room, before Nina Ra taught herself to put it there, for the next person. She photographed everything. She documented everything. She wrote it all into the formal record, where it would be read by people with the authority, to ensure it could not simply be filed away in a categorization system no one thought to check. The 6 previous liaison records were, through a more complex procedural route, and with the energetic assistance of the Accord's third circle coordinator, flagged for review and correction. This would take time, more time than she'd be here for, probably. But it was in motion, and motion was what mattered. The compound's bioluminescent panels cycled through their colors on the day she finished her final dispatch. The deep blue of early morning, the warm gold of midday, the cooler silver of evening approaching. She stood at her workspace and looked at the panels and thought about the 6 people before her and what the official record had said about them and what the truth of it was. 6 qualified, capable, experienced professionals, each of whom had come to this posting and been methodically, carefully, skillfully made smaller until they were small enough to be dismissed, and had been dismissed, and had lived with the weight of that official inadequacy. It was not a small thing to have been inadequate in a formal record. She knew that from her own life, from the corners of it, that she didn't often examine. She hoped the corrections would mean something to them. She thought they would. She thought about something Nina Ra had said in one of their last library sessions, not specifically to her, more in the way of thinking aloud, that the Vethrani philosophical concept of correct order assumed that the universe had a shape that was fixed and predetermined. But the historical compact chronicles she'd spent her career studying told a different story. The early records showed a Vethrani society that had changed, that had evolved, that had revised its understanding of what order meant many times over. The shape of things was not fixed. It was argued. It was fought over. It was, sometimes, with enough documentation and enough courage and enough patience with bureaucratic procedures, amended. Mara thought that was probably the most HFY thing she'd ever heard said by someone who wasn't human. She finished packing on the evening of day 12. The rotation was not technically complete. She had 11 months left. But the Accord coordinator had offered a transfer in light of what she'd been through here, and she had accepted. Not a quiet acceptance. She had requested and received a new posting. The Accord's Enforcement Review Division, which was where the formal correction of the previous liaison records was, being processed, and where she could be useful. Considerably more useful than she could be here, now that Andre Voss knew exactly what kind of instrument she was. Nina Ra and Seth were leaving the same day. Not permanently. There were proceedings to complete, legal arrangements to formalize, 100 small bureaucratic pieces that would take months to settle. But they were leaving the compound. Nina Ra had an address where Mara could reach her once the dust cleared. She'd written it down on a physical piece of paper, Vethrani text, and pressed it into Mara's hand in the corridor that morning with a quiet precision she brought to everything. Mara folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. She was going to write to her. She was almost entirely certain Nina Ra was going to write back. At the airlock, the Helsinki attendant was waiting with the transport. He had the same quiet, careful eyes. He nodded at Mara when she arrived. She nodded back. She did not carry the Vethrani communications device with her. She left it, very deliberately, on the workspace where she'd been leaving it, every time she used the service corridor instead of the main route, every time she'd made her coffee at 0600, every time she'd sat in the secondary library and refused to be steered toward the comfortable reading room in the main residential wing. She left it pinging its precise, faithful 4-minute signal into a now empty room. The airlock closed. The ship began its transit sequence. Mara found the Helsinki attendant in the galley and poured herself the worst cup of coffee she'd had in 12 weeks. Ship coffee, generic, nothing right about it, and stood at the galley window and watched the Veythru seat diminish in the starfield. She drank her terrible coffee. She thought about correct order. She thought about a child asking if she was the one who was fixing things, and about what was actually the right answer to that question. The right answer was fixing implies it was broken, and some of it was never meant to work the way they told you it worked. The right answer was, some systems that look like order are just control that hasn't been named yet. The right answer was you name it, you document it, you read the treaties they signed, and you find the clauses they forgot you knew about, and you use them. The right answer was, a woman ran a long game for 11 years in a locked house and survived and kept her daughter and waited for someone to come in through the service corridor, and finally someone did. She finished her coffee. She went to the small desk in the transit cabin and opened her dispatch interface and began the report on the posting, which would be thorough and accurate and considerably longer than the standard format, and which she would write with the same care she'd brought to every document she'd produced in the past 12 weeks, because the documents mattered and the record mattered, and the 6 people who had come before her and had their competence officially questioned deserved to have someone do this with care. She wrote for 6 hours without stopping. The ship moved through the dark between stars. Somewhere behind her, growing smaller by the minute, the Veythru seat pulsed with its bioluminescent cycles, blue and gold and silver, the colors of correct order, the colors of a house that had always been a kind of prison for anyone who didn't already know the price of everything. Inside it, she wrote until the document was finished and true. Then she saved it and stretched and went to find the Helsinki attendant and ask if there was anywhere on this ship a coffee machine that had been properly maintained. There wasn't. But he knew how to make it work anyway. She thought that was probably sufficient.